Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. If you think Islam teaches violence, then there is one verse in the Qur'an you definitely need to know, because strangely, this verse is hardly mentioned in debates about Islam and terrorism, but it's a verse that completely changes the conversation. So stick around for that. And it's one of many verses that we're going to discuss from the Qur'an about warfare. So when people claim that the Qur'an promotes violence, is that based on a sincere reading or a selective reading of the Qur'an? We're going to find out. So let's get started. Let's start off with Surah number 2, which is Surah Baqarah, verse 190, because the passage from there talks about warfare. So the verse says, fight those who fight you. Now notice, it doesn't say fight those who refuse to convert to Islam. It just says fight those who fight you, okay? And then the verse says, do not transgress, meaning do not fight non-combatants, do not fight innocent people. And then verse 191 says, kill them wherever you overtake them and expel them from wherever they expelled you out. So clearly this is not a blanket statement at all, because the Qur'an is specifying those unbelievers who expelled the Muslims from Mecca in the life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this is a contextual verse. It's referring to a specific situation. And then the verse says, fitna is worse than killing. Now, the word fitna is an Arabic word which means trial as in the oppression that Muslims faced from the unbelievers for practicing their faith in the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then the verse says, do not fight them at Masjid al-Haram, which is the Kaaba in Mecca, until they fight you there. But if they fight you, then kill them. So here, what we can see is that fighting the unbelievers is done only on a condition that they are being hostile, okay? And then verse 192 says, if they cease, then Allah is forgiving and merciful. Okay, now this verse 193, can be easily misunderstood because it says, fight them until the religion is for Allah. Now you might think it means fight the unbelievers until they convert to Islam so that their religion is for Allah. But no, that's not what it means. It actually means fight the unbelievers until they stop oppressing you so that they allow you to practice your faith for Allah. This is why the verse also says fight them until there is no fitna, which as we said refers to oppression. And then the verse says, if they cease, then there is to be no aggression except against the oppressors. So the Quran says it's only the oppressors that should be fought, not innocent people, not people who simply refuse to convert to Islam. And moreover, in verse 194, look what it says there. It says, whoever has assaulted you, then assault him in the same way that he has assaulted you. So it's not saying assault those who don't convert to Islam. It just says assault those who assault you. I mean, how much clearer can these verses be? Okay, now let's turn to Surah number 4, Surah An Nisa, verses 74 and 75, which also talk about warfare. So verse 74 says, he who fights in the cause of Allah and is killed or achieves victory, we will bestow upon him a great reward. Now, if you think this means fighting unbelievers because they don't convert to Islam, well, read the next verse, verse 75, which says that the purpose of fighting is to defend the oppressed. So basically defending them from oppression. Hence the verse says, why do you not fight to defend the oppressed amongst men, women and children? Now let's turn to verse 89 of Surah Nisa, which again talks about warfare. Now here it says, seize them and kill them wherever you find them. And these words can be misused and abused by Islamophobes who claim that this is a blanket statement that instructs Muslims to kill people if they don't convert to Islam, which I would describe as a very selective reading of the Quran, because when we read the next verse, it makes an exception. It specifies those who the Muslims should not fight. It says, except for those who take refuge with a people between yourselves and with whom there is a treaty. And then later in the verse, it says, if they remove themselves from you and they do not fight you and they offer you peace, then Allah has not made you a cause for fighting against them. So the Quran instructs the Muslims to not fight those who are not fighting and who offer peace. And then again, when we read the next verse, verse 91, it says, if they do not withdraw from you or offer you peace or restrain their hands, then seize them and kill them wherever you overtake them. So it orders Muslims to fight unbelievers only on the condition that they are being hostile, okay, that they are attacking you. Now let's look at some verses about war in Surah number 8, Surah An Anfal. So let's look at the 39th 9th verse. It says, fight them until there is no fitna and until the religion is for Allah. Now, this is a very similar verse to the one that we saw earlier from Surah Al Baqarah. So again, the verse does not mean fight the unbelievers until they accept Islam so that the religion is for Allah, but it means fight them so that there is no oppression from the unbelievers, so that the Muslims can practice their religion for Allah. And then look at the previous verse, verse 38, which provides some context. It says, say to those who disbelieved that if they cease fighting, then they will be forgiven. Meaning that if the unbelievers stop their hostility, then the Muslims will stop fighting them. And then let's go to verse 60 of the same chapter, okay, chapter 8. Again, it's talking about war, but it's not talking about waging war against unbelievers for not accepting Islam, because when we read the next verse, guess what it says? It says that if the unbelievers incline to peace, then the Muslims should incline to peace as well. Now let's turn to Surah number 9, Surah At Tawbah, verse number 5. It says, kill the polytheists wherever you find them, capture them, besiege them, sit in wait for them at every place of ambush. It is this particular verse which is quoted by Islamophobes as if this is a rule saying that we must slay every non-Muslim. Again, as always, they dismiss the context that surrounds this verse. Because when we read this chapter from the very beginning, it's talking about a peace treaty that was made between the polytheists and the Muslims at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. And then when we read verses 8, 10, and 13 of this same chapter, they say that the unbelievers broke the peace treaty and became hostile with the Muslims. Plus you have verse 12, which clearly commands Muslims to fight only on the condition that the unbelievers become hostile. So the context here is talking about those non-Muslims in particular and not all non-Muslims. So therefore, when verse 5 says kill the polytheists wherever you find them, it's referring to killing combatants, those who show hostility. And that's not all, because when you look at verses 4 and 7 of this chapter, they instruct Muslims not to fight those who do not show hostility. Now, another verse that is misused and abused by Islamophobes is verse 29 of the same chapter, okay, chapter 9, Surah Tawbah. Since the verse says fight those who do not believe in Allah or in the last day, it sounds like the Muslims are being commanded to fight the unbelievers because of the fact that they do not believe in Islam. But we know that this verse is referring to fighting hostile enemies in a war situation, because when we read the chapter from the beginning, it's talking about a war situation following a peace treaty having been broken. Okay, now we're going to jump to Surah number 22, which is Surah Hajj. So let's look at verse 39. It says, permission to fight has been given to those who are being fought because they were wronged. So the companions of the Prophet ﷺ were allowed to fight the unbelievers, not because the unbelievers did not convert to Islam, no, but because the unbelievers oppressed the Muslims. But if the Qur'an is meant to instruct us to kill non-Muslims because they don't convert to Islam, then why is this verse worded the way that it is? Why is it saying that Muslims had to fight because they were being wronged, instead of saying Muslims had to fight because the unbelievers did not convert? Now pay attention to the next verse, and I have to say the next verse is such an eye-opener. Honestly, I think this verse has got to be the biggest mic drop for Islamophobes who think that the Qur'an teaches violence towards other faiths. So this is a verse that you definitely must know, and this is the verse I was talking about at the start of the video. Look at what the verse says. It says, if it were not that Allah checks the people some by means of others, there would have been monasteries, churches, synagogues, and mosques demolished in which the name of Allah is mentioned. So here the Qur'an is talking about Muslims fighting to defend non-Muslim places of worship, okay, fighting to defend the rights of non-Muslims to practice their faiths. So this verse proves that Islam is tolerant of other religions, and it clearly says that the name of Allah is mentioned in these non-Muslim places of worship. And what do we hear from Islamophobes? They say that Islam is intolerant of other faiths and Muslims want to kill people of other faiths. Okay, well, if that's the case, why is the Qur'an talking about the Muslims defending the non-Muslim places of worship? Not to mention, of course, that in Surah Al Baqarah, verse 256, it says there is no compulsion in religion, and in Surah Saf, Surah 60, verse number 8, it says that Allah does not forbid you from being righteous and just with those who have not fought you and who have not driven you out of your homes. So these are a selection of verses that I have discussed from the Qur'an concerning warfare, and clearly when we read them properly, when we read them sincerely in their context, it becomes very clear that in no way, shape, or form is the Qur'an instructing Muslims to fight people simply because they do not convert to Islam, simply because they are unbelievers. So if you've enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, leave a comment below, please share, consider subscribing. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.